Before another thought steals your attention, remain here for a moment, because something gentle has been unfolding around your name in places you cannot see. Not in crowded rooms. Not in dramatic conversations. Not in the loud moments people usually notice. It has been happening quietly. Almost invisibly. And that is why it matters. There are conversations taking place that do not begin with you, yet somehow they keep returning to you. A passing mention becomes a longer discussion. A simple question turns into curiosity. A small detail becomes something people remember long after the moment has passed. What makes this unusual is that the people speaking are not strangers. They are connected to someone whose path has been moving closer to yours in ways neither of you fully understand yet. Do not rush ahead. Do not try to guess the ending. Because the meaning behind these conversations is deeper than appearances suggest. Something important is waiting for you. There is a reason your presence keeps entering their thoughts. There is a reason your name carries a feeling they struggle to explain. And there is a reason that what began as simple curiosity is becoming something much more meaningful. Tonight, I want to show you how it started. Not with a grand event. Not with a perfect moment. But with one small detail that nobody expected to matter. A detail so ordinary that it almost went unnoticed. Yet somehow, it stayed. And once it stayed, everything slowly began to change. A strange thing happens when a person's name begins to carry warmth before familiarity. Most people assume that connection starts after long conversations, shared memories, or countless moments spent together. But sometimes, the heart notices something long before the mind can explain it. And that is exactly where this story continues. Somewhere, in a conversation that was never meant to be significant, your name appeared once again. No announcement. No dramatic introduction. Just a simple mention. Yet the moment it was spoken, something shifted. The room continued as normal. The discussion moved forward. People talked about ordinary things. But beneath those ordinary words, a quiet curiosity remained. One person wondered what kind of person you truly were. Another remembered something they had heard before. Someone else recalled a small detail that seemed insignificant at the time but now felt strangely important. None of them planned to think about you for very long. Yet somehow, they did. And what makes this moment meaningful is not what they said. It is why they kept saying it. Because conversations do not return to the same person repeatedly without reason. Especially when those conversations are coming from people who are naturally protective of someone they deeply care about. They were not searching for perfection. They were not creating unrealistic expectations. They were simply trying to understand why your presence continued appearing in the story of someone they love. And the more they tried to understand, the more interesting the answers became. Stay here. Do not rush through these words. Because what happened next reveals something many people never realize. The people closest to someone's heart often notice changes before anyone else. They notice different expressions. Different energy. Different priorities. Different silences. And recently, those subtle changes had become impossible to ignore. Someone in your soulmate's family began noticing that whenever certain topics appeared, there was a different reaction. A different smile. A different level of attention. A different glow that seemed impossible to hide completely. It was never obvious enough to be explained. Yet it was impossible to overlook. And so the questions began. Not serious questions. Not interrogations. Just gentle curiosity. The kind that naturally appears when people care. The kind that grows little by little. The kind that begins with simple observations and slowly transforms into something deeper. One evening, a casual conversation drifted in an unexpected direction. Nobody planned it. Nobody prepared for it. Yet somehow the discussion landed on relationships, future hopes, meaningful connections, and the kind of person who leaves a lasting impression. For a moment, everything felt ordinary. Then your name entered the conversation again. And this time, it stayed longer. The discussion did not move away. It expanded. People began sharing thoughts. Not because they were trying to analyze you. Because they were trying to understand what made you different. What made you memorable. What made your presence continue returning to the surface. And the answers surprised even them. Someone mentioned your kindness. Not because kindness is rare. But because genuine kindness is. There is a difference. People notice when kindness is performed. People also notice when it is simply who someone is. That distinction matters more than most realize. Another person mentioned the way you carry yourself. Not in terms of appearance. Not in terms of status. But in terms of energy. The way certain people make others feel comfortable without trying. The way they create calm without demanding attention. The way they leave behind a feeling rather than an impression. And suddenly the conversation became less about facts and more about feelings. That is when something important happened. The room grew quieter. Not physically. Emotionally. Because everyone was beginning to recognize the same thing from different angles. You had become memorable without forcing yourself into anyone's attention. And that is rare. Very rare. The world teaches people to chase visibility. To compete for recognition. To demand to be seen. Yet some of the most powerful impressions are created by people who never try to create them at all. Your energy had spoken in places your voice never reached. Your character had arrived before explanations ever did. And because of that, curiosity continued growing. What fascinated them most was not who you appeared to be. It was who you seemed to remain. Consistency has a quiet power. Many people can create a strong first impression. Far fewer create a lasting one. Because lasting impressions require authenticity. And authenticity reveals itself over time. The more they heard. The more they learned. The more they observed. The more one realization kept returning. You seemed genuine. Not perfect. Not flawless. Not larger than life. Simply genuine. And that quality carries extraordinary weight in a world filled with performance. Something important is waiting for you, because this realization led the conversation somewhere nobody expected. Instead of discussing surface details, they began discussing possibility. Not certainty. Possibility. The possibility that certain people enter our lives for reasons we only understand later. The possibility that meaningful connections often begin quietly. The possibility that some relationships feel familiar long before they become official. As these thoughts unfolded, someone asked a simple question. A question so ordinary that it almost disappeared into the conversation. Yet it changed everything. They asked. What is it about this person that keeps coming up? Silence followed. Not uncomfortable silence. Thoughtful silence. The kind that appears when people suddenly realize they have been feeling something they have not yet put into words. Nobody answered immediately. Because everyone was searching for the same thing. An explanation. And explanations are not always easy when the heart notices something before logic does. Eventually, someone spoke. Slowly. Carefully. They said that certain people feel familiar even when they are still becoming known. That some individuals carry a presence that feels trustworthy before trust has fully formed. That there are moments when life introduces someone who simply feels different. The room became quiet again. Because nobody disagreed. And perhaps that was the most revealing part of all. No debate. No resistance. Just quiet agreement. As though everyone had arrived at the same conclusion independently. Your soulmate's family was not becoming interested because of a single story. Or a single moment. Or a single detail. They were becoming interested because every small detail pointed toward the same larger picture. And that picture continued growing clearer. What they saw was someone whose presence seemed to bring peace rather than confusion. Someone whose energy felt steady rather than chaotic. Someone whose influence appeared positive even from a distance. And little by little, their curiosity transformed into something warmer. Respect. Not blind admiration. Not unrealistic expectations. Respect. The kind that grows slowly. The kind that cannot be rushed. The kind that lasts because it is built on observation rather than imagination. Meanwhile, something else was happening behind the scenes. Your soulmate had no idea how obvious certain things were becoming. People often believe they hide their feelings well. But the people closest to them usually notice more than they realize. A change in tone. A change in expression. A change in attention. Small clues begin forming a larger story. And that larger story was becoming impossible to ignore. Whenever your name appeared, something softened. Whenever a conversation touched certain subjects, a different energy emerged. Whenever future possibilities were discussed, there was a subtle shift that spoke louder than words. Nobody needed an explanation. Because some truths reveal themselves naturally. And this truth was beginning to reveal itself. Not dramatically. Not suddenly. But steadily. Like sunrise. Like light slowly entering a room. Like a picture becoming clearer with each passing moment. That is why the conversations continued. Not because anyone was trying to interfere. Because people naturally become curious when they witness something meaningful taking shape. And what they were witnessing felt meaningful. Even if they could not fully explain why. Days passed. More conversations happened. More observations appeared. And each one seemed to confirm the previous one. The image they had formed of you was becoming stronger. More complete. More genuine. Not because you were trying to convince anyone of anything. Because authenticity tends to reveal itself naturally over time. That is one of the quiet truths many people forget. You do not have to force the right people to see who you are. Character eventually introduces itself. Integrity eventually speaks. Kindness eventually leaves evidence. And sincerity eventually becomes visible. Even when you are not present. Even when nobody tells you. Even when you never hear about it. The impact remains. The conversations remain. The impressions remain. And somewhere within those ongoing discussions, another realization began forming. One that nobody said aloud at first. A realization that lingered beneath every exchange. A realization connected not only to who you were, but to what your presence might mean for the future. And when that realization finally reaches the surface, the conversation will change in a way neither you nor they expected. Because the next thing they begin discussing is not your past. It is not your personality. It is not even the reason they first became curious. It is something far deeper. Something far more personal. Something that reveals why your name keeps returning no matter how many times the conversation moves on. And that moment is closer than anyone realizes. There is a moment in certain conversations when curiosity quietly transforms into investment. Most people never notice exactly when it happens. There is no announcement. No dramatic pause. No visible line being crossed. One moment, people are simply discussing someone. The next, they find themselves genuinely wondering what that person's future might look like. And somewhere within your soulmate's family, that shift had already begun. Not all at once. Not because of a single event. But because every conversation seemed to add another piece to a picture that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. At first, they spoke about you as someone connected to a story. Then they spoke about you as someone connected to a possibility. Now, without fully realizing it, they were beginning to speak about you as someone who felt strangely familiar. And familiarity is powerful. Not the familiarity that comes from years of knowing someone. The kind that comes from recognizing qualities that feel rare. The kind that creates trust before certainty. The kind that makes people pause and pay attention. One afternoon, a discussion unfolded that seemed ordinary on the surface. Family members were talking about life. About timing. About unexpected turns. About how people often spend years searching for things they never find, only to discover them when they stop looking so hard. The conversation drifted naturally. Nobody was steering it. Nobody had a specific goal. Yet somehow, your name appeared once again. And this time, something unexpected happened. Instead of asking questions about you, someone began sharing what they appreciated. Not assumptions. Not guesses. Appreciation. The difference matters. Questions come from curiosity. Appreciation comes from recognition. And recognition only grows after repeated observation. One person mentioned the way you seem to bring calm into situations that could easily become complicated. Another spoke about your ability to remain genuine even when many people would be tempted to become someone else. Someone else mentioned that there was something refreshing about the way you seemed comfortable being yourself. The comments were simple. Yet each one carried weight. Because none of them were trying to impress anyone. They were simply speaking honestly. And honesty has a way of revealing truths people did not realize they already believed. The room grew thoughtful. Not because anyone had run out of words. Because everyone was beginning to see the same pattern. Every observation pointed toward character. Not image. Not status. Not appearance. Character. The qualities that remain when everything else changes. The qualities that matter years later. The qualities that create foundations instead of impressions. Stay with this moment. Because something important is waiting for you here. Many people spend their lives wondering how they are perceived. They worry about what others think. They question whether they are enough. They wonder if their efforts are noticed. Yet some of the most meaningful recognition happens completely outside their awareness. While they are simply living. Simply growing. Simply becoming who they are meant to be. That was the quiet truth unfolding here. You were not present to explain yourself. You were not there to influence the discussion. You were not defending your character or presenting your strengths. And perhaps that is exactly why the conversation mattered so much. Because what people were seeing was not a performance. It was a reflection of what remained visible even when you were absent. That realization stayed in the room long after the conversation should have ended. And as it lingered, another layer began to emerge. A deeper one. One that nobody had been ready to address before. The topic shifted toward the future. Not directly. Indirectly. The way meaningful subjects often do. Someone mentioned how quickly life changes. Another talked about how unexpected connections sometimes become the most significant. A third reflected on how difficult it can be to recognize something valuable while it is still unfolding. The words seemed unrelated. Yet beneath them, a common thread was forming. Everyone could feel it. Nobody had spoken it yet. But everyone could feel it. Then came a question. A simple one. The kind that enters a room softly yet changes everything. Someone asked. What if this becomes something important? The room fell silent. Not because the question was shocking. Because it was honest. And honesty often arrives with a weight that demands reflection. For a few seconds, nobody answered. Each person sat with the possibility. Not rushing. Not forcing conclusions. Simply allowing the thought to exist. What if this becomes something important? What if this connection continues growing? What if the reason your name keeps returning is because it is connected to something larger than anyone initially realized? Those questions remained suspended in the air. And slowly, one by one, people began considering them seriously. Not with pressure. Not with expectations. With openness. Because meaningful things deserve openness. One family member spoke first. They shared a story from years earlier. A story about how some of the most important relationships in life begin quietly. How they rarely announce themselves. How they often arrive disguised as ordinary moments. The room listened carefully. Not because the story was extraordinary. Because it felt relevant. Another person added their own experience. They talked about how certain people enter your life and create a sense of peace rather than confusion. A sense of clarity rather than uncertainty. A feeling that things are unfolding naturally rather than being forced. Again, nobody disagreed. And once again, your name remained connected to those reflections. Not intentionally. Naturally. As though every road in the conversation kept leading back to the same place. Back to you. Back to the impression you had left. Back to the possibility people were slowly beginning to acknowledge. At this point, something remarkable had happened. The discussion was no longer focused on whether you were worthy of attention. That question had quietly disappeared. Instead, the conversation had become focused on understanding why your presence felt so significant. Why you continued standing out. Why your influence seemed larger than the amount of time involved. Why your name carried a feeling that was difficult to explain. And while nobody possessed all the answers, one realization became increasingly clear. You represented something genuine. Something steady. Something real. In a world where so many interactions feel temporary, authenticity creates a powerful impression. People remember it. People trust it. People talk about it. Not because it is flashy. Because it is rare. Days continued passing. Yet the conversations did not disappear. If anything, they became more thoughtful. More personal. More meaningful. There were moments when your soulmate's family found themselves discussing hopes for the future. The kind of future that feels less like a plan and more like a possibility. The kind of future built on values rather than appearances. The kind of future that lasts. And every time those discussions unfolded, your name seemed to find its way back into the room. Not forced. Not inserted. Simply returning. As though it belonged there. That alone spoke volumes. Because people do not continue talking about someone merely because they are interesting. Interest fades. Novelty fades. Curiosity fades. What remains is substance. And substance was exactly what they believed they were seeing. There was another reason these conversations continued. One that few people fully understood at the time. Every family hopes for the happiness of the people they love. Every family wants to see them surrounded by individuals who bring out their best qualities. Every family notices when someone seems brighter. More hopeful. More peaceful. And lately, those changes had become impossible to miss. Your soulmate was changing in subtle ways. Not becoming a different person. Becoming more themselves. More relaxed. More optimistic. More present. The kind of changes that happen when someone begins imagining new possibilities. The kind of changes that cannot be faked. The kind of changes that naturally draw attention. Family members noticed. Of course they did. How could they not? Love often reveals itself through transformation before it reveals itself through words. And while nobody was rushing ahead or making assumptions, they could see that something meaningful was unfolding. Something that deserved respect. Something that deserved patience. Something that deserved time. That realization created an entirely new atmosphere around the conversations. The focus shifted again. This time, toward understanding not only who you were, but what kind of future might become possible if this connection continued growing. The questions became deeper. The reflections became more personal. And hidden within those discussions was a realization nobody expected. A realization about you that would surprise even the people saying it. Because they were beginning to recognize a quality that goes beyond charm. Beyond attraction. Beyond first impressions. A quality that people rarely discover immediately. A quality that only becomes visible after careful observation. And when that realization finally reaches the surface, it will change the entire tone of these conversations. Because the next thing they begin discussing is not what they think about you. It is what they trust about you. And that distinction changes everything. What they say next reveals more than curiosity. More than admiration. More than interest. It reveals belief. A quiet belief that something meaningful may be unfolding far sooner than anyone expected. And that conversation is about to begin.